31 problem mules. Sold as one lot. No guarantees. The auctioneer barely glanced at the pen before he said it, and the room laughed before he'd even finished the sentence. 31 animals stood packed together at the back of the sale barn, scarred, mismatched, hooves worn down to nothing, off a mountain outfitting company that had gone bankrupt 6 months earlier. Every other pen that afternoon had animals shifting, spooked, straining against the noise of the crowd. These 31 stood completely still. You'd need 31 reasons to buy those. A rancher near the front called out, and got a bigger laugh than the auctioneer had. Dana Ruiz had $4,000 in her account, and had come to that auction for exactly 2 horses. She raised her hand for the mules instead. The room went quiet just long enough for her to hear her own pulse before somebody started laughing again, louder this time, and the auctioneer asked if she was serious. She didn't answer him directly. She just kept her hand up until the gavel came down, and walked out an hour later having spent nearly everything she had on 31 animals nobody else in that building would take for free. She had 90 days left on a loan payment that could cost her the 10 acres she and her 2 kids lived on, no plan for where 31 mules were going to sleep that night, and no idea yet that one of them was about to break her arm before the month was out. What she did know, standing at that trailer with a decision she couldn't fully explain even to herself, was that every animal in that pen had been watching the same thing since before the bidding opened. An old pack saddle hanging on the rail nobody else in the room had thought twice about. As you watch, see if you can work out what that saddle meant to them before Dana did, because by the time she understood it, it wasn't just her land on the line anymore. She'd almost put her hand down twice before the gavel fell. The 2 horses she'd actually come for had already sold, both gone for more than she'd budgeted, which was part of why she was still standing at the rail when the mule pen came up. Money already tighter than she'd planned for, common sense telling her to leave before she did something worse. The auctioneer's assistant, a heavy-set man in a canvas coat, hung the pack saddle on the rail almost as an afterthought, something pulled from the same lot to be sold separately once the animals went through. Dana watched all 31 heads turn toward it at once, a single motion, like something had been said out loud that only they could hear. "Do I have 500? The auctioneer said, and got nothing. 400. 3. The number kept dropping, the room's attention already drifting toward the next lot. A few people near the front already checking their phones. Dana raised her hand at 200, more out of some instinct she couldn't name than any plan, and the room's attention snapped back fast enough that she felt it like a change in temperature. "You're bidding on the whole lot, ma'am. All 31. I understand that." Nobody topped her. The gavel came down within 30 seconds, and Dana stood there afterward with her heart going hard enough that she barely heard the rancher near the front telling his neighbor she'd just bought herself a world of trouble. Dana had come to that auction with a plan simple enough to fit on an index card. 2 horses, dependable and trail broke. A small weekend guiding business on the side, enough to cover the difference between what her part-time work at the feed store paid and what the loan on her 10 acres actually required. The loan itself was the complicated part, a note her ex-husband's family had partial claim to since the divorce, 90 days from due, with a clause that let them call it early if payments slipped even once. She hadn't told her kids the full shape of that deadline. Mia was 14 and would have understood it too well. Jackson was 9 and didn't need to carry it at all. She hadn't told them she'd bought 31 mules either, not until she was already backing the trailer up the driveway that evening, both of them coming out onto the porch to see what the racket was. "Mom," Mia said, staring at the trailer like it might be a trick of the light. "Where are we going to put 31 mules?" "I was hoping you'd have an idea," Dana said, which wasn't a joke exactly. The first problem showed up before she'd even gotten the trailer gate fully open. 31 mules didn't want to unload as individuals, packed nose to tail, and refusing to move whenever she tried to lead one out alone. It was Mia, watching from the fence, who suggested letting the oldest one, a heavy-boned gray gelding with a scarred left ear, go first. He walked down the ramp calm as anything, and the other 30 followed him without hesitation, filing out in an order that looked less like chaos and more like a system nobody had explained to Dana yet. She named him Ranger that first night, mostly because he needed a name, and it was the only word that came to mind watching him stand at the gate of her hastily fenced back pasture, 30 other mules settling in around him like he'd told them it was safe to. Word moved through the small mountain town fast enough that by the end of the week, Dana had heard 3 separate versions of her own auction story repeated back to her, each one making her sound a little more foolish than the last. The sharpest version came directly from Trent Kessler, who ran the only established horse outfitting business in the valley and had, until that week, been the closest thing Dana had to a professional mentor. "You do know what this does to me," Trent said, catching her at the feed store the following Tuesday, voice low enough to seem private, but not quite low enough to actually be private. "Tourists don't want mule rides, Dana. They want the postcard. Pretty horses, easy trails. You show up with 31 broken-down pack mules undercutting my season, and it's not just embarrassing for you. It's a real problem for my business. I'm not trying to undercut anybody, Trent. I bought 2 horses worth of money in mules I didn't plan on. Doesn't matter what you planned. Matters what people see." He shook his head and walked off before she could answer. And Dana understood, standing there with a bag of feed she couldn't really afford, that whatever this was going to become, it wasn't going to be simple. She noticed the pattern with the pack saddle almost by accident, hanging an old one on the fence rail while she cleaned tack one evening. Every mule in the pasture turned toward it at once, ears forward, the whole herd's attention snapping to a single point the way a compass needle finds north. She tried it again the next morning with a different saddle, an ordinary riding one. Nothing. Only the old pack saddle got that reaction every single time. The call to the county extension office went nowhere useful, but a second call, to a retired feed supplier named Otis who'd once done business with the bankrupt outfitting company, finally gave her something real to work with. That outfit ran pack strings into the backcountry for better than 20 years, Otis told her over the phone, his voice crackling slightly on an old landline. Not trail rides for tourists. Real supply work, fencing materials, fuel, medical gear, whatever a remote section of forest needed that a truck couldn't reach. Mules did that work for decades before anybody built roads good enough to compete with them. So why'd they fail? Same reason most things like that fail. Somebody bought newer trucks, decided the mules were an expensive relic, and by the time that turned out to be a mistake, the company that made it was already 6 months from bankrupt. Otis paused. Whole string got dumped together at that sale. Surprised anybody bought all 31 at once. Usually they get split up, sold off individual, and whatever those animals knew about that mountain just goes with them into somebody's stew pot eventually. Dana sat with the phone in her hand a long while after she hung up, looking out at 31 mules grazing a pasture built for 2 horses, understanding for the first time exactly what she'd actually bought that afternoon. They weren't randomly assembled stock. They'd worked together for years as a single mountain pack string, carrying supplies into backcountry sections no road reached, trained collectively rather than individually, the older animals teaching the younger ones routes and behavior the way any working culture passes knowledge down. They weren't useless. They were built for a job the modern world had simply stopped asking anyone to do. The work of actually running 31 mules on 10 acres meant for 2 horses started teaching Dana things no amount of research could have. She filed cracked hooves by lamplight some evenings, learned which animals in the string calmed the younger ones during thunderstorms, spent hours simply watching rather than directing, trying to understand a system that had clearly worked for years before she ever touched it. The injury happened in the 3rd week, fast enough that Dana never fully reconstructed the sequence afterward beyond the sound of it. A younger mule, still carrying trauma from however it had been handled at the old outfit, spooked at a dropped feed bucket and kicked out sideways before Dana could clear the stall. She remembered the impact more than the pain at first, a white flash of force against her forearm that dropped her to her knees in the mud. Mia screamed somewhere behind her before the actual pain caught up and made itself impossible to ignore. The break wasn't clean. The ER doctor described it in terms Dana only half absorbed through the shock and painkillers, something about the radius requiring a longer cast than usual, 6 weeks minimum, no heavy lifting for 2 months after that. She spent those 6 weeks unable to do half the physical work the string actually required, leaning hard on Mia and on neighbors she barely knew well enough to ask for help. Maybe Trent's right, she told her sister on the phone that week, more exhausted than she'd let herself sound in months. Maybe I just made an expensive, stupid decision because it felt like the first thing that was mine to decide in years. Her sister didn't have a comforting answer for that, and Dana didn't really want one. She just needed to say it out loud once. Winter made the decision for her that the cast injury had only delayed. 31 mules ate through hay reserves faster than her budget could replace, and by November, with the loan deadline closing in and her arm barely out of the cast, Dana faced math that had exactly one honest answer. She spent 3 nights running numbers before she made the calls, trying to find any version of the arithmetic that let her keep the full string. There wasn't one. She sold 9 mules that winter, not to Trent, who never offered, but to a rancher 2 counties over who ran a smaller, more manageable operation and paid a fair enough price to cover the worst of the shortfall. She kept Ranger. She kept the ones she'd started to understand individually rather than as part of the mass. Loading those 9 onto a stranger's trailer took most of a cold Saturday morning. Dana working the chute herself despite the cast still on her arm, unwilling to let anyone else do the part that felt like it belonged to her specifically. Mia stood at the fence the whole time, not saying much, and Jackson refused to come outside at all, watching from his bedroom window instead. Watching that trailer pull away with 9 animals she'd fought to keep only months earlier felt like exactly the kind of failure she'd been trying to avoid since April, and she sat in the truck afterward for a long while before she trusted herself to drive back to the house. One more loss came before spring, harder in its way than the sale because there was no decision to make, nothing she could have chosen differently with the money she actually had. Duchess, an older mule arthritic even at the original auction, worsened faster than Dana's stretched budget could keep up with proper veterinary care. Dana called the vet twice that January, each visit costing more than she had room for, each one buying only a little more time rather than any real improvement. Duchess died in February, quietly, in the coldest week of the whole winter, found still and cold in the shelter shed on a morning when the thermometer read 11 below. Dana buried her herself with a borrowed tractor because she couldn't afford to hire it done, working alone in ground so frozen it took most of the day, crying at some point without fully noticing she'd started. She didn't tell Trent about that loss. She didn't tell anyone much of anything that winter, working through a season that tested every part of the decision she'd made in June without offering her a single clean victory to hold on to. The first real crack in the town's opinion came in early spring, when a neighbor's tractor slid off a steep, muddy section of his own back pasture and stuck fast enough that no truck or equipment could reach it without risking a second machine. Dana brought 4 mules up the slope with chains, and within an hour the tractor was free, hauled clear by animals that could go places no wheeled equipment on the property could follow. The neighbor didn't apologize for anything he'd said at the diner that winter. He just asked, plainly, what she'd charge to do it again sometime. Word moved a little differently after that. Not enough to change Trent's opinion, but enough that a retired Forest Service packer named Walt Osei drove out one Saturday that spring, having heard secondhand about a woman running a full mule string nobody in the valley quite understood. Walt was 71, 30 years of backcountry pack work behind him, and he walked the pasture fence a long while before he said much of anything. "You know what you've got here?" he finally asked. "A lot of debt and not much of a plan," Dana said. Walt almost smiled at that. "You've got a working string that still remembers how to work. That's rarer than you think. Most operations break these strings up the second they go under, sell the animals off individually, and the knowledge just dies with the sale. Whoever ran that outfit before it failed, they kept this group together on purpose. Man understood what he had, even if the business didn't survive him understanding it. He came back most Saturdays after that, teaching Dana things about packstring handling that no amount of solo trial and error would have gotten her to as fast. One morning in May, he had her stand at the far fence and simply watch the string cross a section of uneven, rocky ground without any direction from either of them. "Tell me what Ranger does before he steps anywhere he hasn't already tested," Walt said. Dana watched. It took her 3 passes before she saw it clearly. A slight pause, weight shifting back before committing forward, a testing motion so subtle she'd walked past it 100 times without registering what it actually was. He checks it first. Every single time. That's not habit. That's calculation. A horse in a panic just runs. Flight instinct doesn't stop to check anything, which is exactly why a spooked horse will run off a cliff it could have avoided walking. A mule's whole nervous system works different. Self-preservation first, obedience second. You cannot force that instinct out of them, and you shouldn't want to. Man who ran this string before you understood that. Built decades of route knowledge into these animals because he trusted their judgment more than his own, in country dangerous enough that trusting the wrong judgment gets somebody killed. How do you know all this, Walt? Really? 30 years running Forest Service strings into backcountry sections just as unforgiving as whatever's out past your ridge. Lost a horse packer I trained with, my second season, ground not much different from what you're running these animals on now. Mule string right behind him made it through the same stretch without a stumble. He looked out at Ranger, still testing ground with that same patient, deliberate care. I don't teach this for sentiment, Dana. I teach it because I've buried people who trusted the wrong animal in the wrong country. The wildfire started in July, fast and ugly, the way mountain fires do when a dry spring meets an unlucky lightning strike. It moved quickly enough that a trail crew and a small group of backcountry hikers found themselves cut off on the wrong side of a section of steep, loose scree, terrain a truck couldn't reach, and horses, panicked by smoke and unstable footing, wouldn't cross under any amount of urging. The Forest Service put out an emergency call for pack support within the hour. Trent's operation, the largest and best equipped in the valley, tried first. His horses balked hard at the scree section, two of them nearly going down on the loose rock before the lead wrangler called it off entirely. Unwilling to risk animals or riders on ground they clearly couldn't manage under smoke. Dana got the call 20 minutes later, not from Trent directly, but from the same Forest Service coordinator who'd been told, by more than one person in the valley now, that there was a mule string on the Ruiz place that might actually be able to make that crossing. She didn't hesitate the way she expected to. She grabbed the old pack saddle off the shed wall without quite thinking about why. The same one that had first pulled every head in that auction pen toward it a year earlier, and put it on Ranger herself, hands moving faster than her thoughts. She loaded him in 11 of the steadiest mules from the remaining string, Walt riding out with her without being asked twice, and headed for the fire line with smoke already visible over the ridge. The scree crossing was worse in person than anyone's description had prepared her for. Loose rock shifting underfoot with every step, visibility dropping in and out as smoke rolled through the pass, heat radiating off the burned slope above them even from a distance. Dana's throat burned with every breath, eyes streaming. The world narrowed down to Ranger's back and the few feet of ground she could actually see in front of them. Halfway across, a section of scree gave way beneath one of the younger mules, a sickening slide of loose rock that dropped the animal's back legs out from under it for one heart-stopping second before it scrambled back to solid footing on its own, without panic, without bolting the way a horse would have. Dana's own heart didn't slow down for several minutes afterward, watching Ranger continue testing each step ahead with the same deliberate, unhurried process Walt had described weeks earlier, an animal calculating risk instead of simply reacting to fear. The younger mules followed his lead exactly, stepping where he'd stepped, and the string crossed ground that had turned back the valley's best-equipped horse operation less than an hour earlier. They reached the trail crew and hikers a little past 4 that afternoon. 6 people, 2 with minor injuries, all of them badly frightened and running low on water, genuinely relieved in a way that made Dana's chest tight watching it. One of the hikers, a woman not much older than Mia, grabbed Dana's arm the moment she was close enough and just said, "Thank you," 3 times in a row before she could manage anything else. Loading them onto the string for the return crossing took careful, patient work, Walt managing the human side of it, while Dana focused on keeping the mules calm through smoke thick enough now to sting her eyes. The return crossing took longer, heavier, more dangerous with passengers who weren't used to the animals or the terrain, several of them gripping the pack rigging tight enough that Dana had to remind them twice to trust the animal under them rather than fighting its movement. Ranger led it the same deliberate way, the old pack saddle he'd first turned to look at in an auction barn a year earlier, now doing exactly the work it had spent decades being built for. And by the time they cleared the scree section and reached the trucks waiting at the trailhead, Dana's hands were shaking hard enough that Walt had to help her unload the gear. Nobody was hurt further. Nobody was lost. It wasn't dramatic in the way rescues look in movies, just hours of careful, unglamorous work by animals built for exactly this, and mostly forgotten for it. Trent called her 2 days later, not to apologize, not with any particular warmth in his voice, just professional and direct in a way that told Dana he'd already worked through whatever pride the conversation was costing him before he dialed. Forest Service is putting together a standing contract list for backcountry support through fire season, he said. They asked if I knew anyone running stock that could handle that terrain. I told them about your string. That's it. No, I was wrong about the mules first. You already know I was wrong. Didn't figure you needed to hear me say it. A pause, long enough that Dana almost thought he'd hung up. You did something out there my horses couldn't do, Dana. That's just true. Doesn't mean I have to enjoy saying it. It wasn't the apology she might have imagined wanting back in June, standing at that trailer with 31 mules and no plan. It was better, in its own way, not vindication, just two people who did difficult work finally seeing each other clearly. A year after the auction, Dana's operation looked nothing like the tidy postcard business she'd originally planned around 2 horses. She ran 22 mules now, not 31, 9 sold, 1 lost. A number that still cost her something every time she counted the string and came up short of where she'd started. Her arm ached in cold weather in a way the doctor told her probably wouldn't ever fully go away. But the loan had been paid on time that November. Backcountry contract work from 3 different agencies covering more than her original weekend guiding plan ever would have. Mia had learned to handle half the string herself, and Jackson, older now, had stopped asking when Mom was going to sell the mules and just started calling them his. Walt still came out most Saturdays. Trent still ran his horse operation next door, professional rather than warm, sending backcountry clients her way when the terrain called for it, and never once again in a year mentioning postcards. Dana stood at the fence one evening that summer, watching Ranger move the string toward water the same unhurried, deliberate way he'd led them off that trailer a year earlier, and understood that none of it had turned out the way she'd planned it in June, and most of it hadn't turned out clean either. She'd lost animals. She'd lost money she couldn't really afford to lose. She'd broken her arm, learning a lesson the hard way that could have been taught gentler if she'd known enough to ask the right questions first. What she hadn't lost was the string itself, and the particular, hard-won understanding that the animals everyone in that sale barn called useless had simply been waiting for someone willing to learn what they actually knew. If a story like this, messy, costly, not entirely clean, but true in the way real bets on yourself usually are, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever made a decision that cost you more than you expected before it finally paid off, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.